Cool. Shows us live, and we are live with Patrick Wolf. He did his PhD. Is the political science department, Pat?
They call it the Department of Government, but it's really political science.
Political science PhD at Harvard University. And for our listeners, as you know, there's been a huge backlash to a current Harvard Law School professor, Elizabeth Bartholet, who calls for a presumptive ban on the practice of homeschooling. I've been talking about this with guests on both of my podcasts for weeks now, and the discussion has gotten reignited because of a piece that came out just a couple of days ago in the Harvard Gazette, which is an official media arm of Harvard University. The other papers on the risks of homeschooling and the other one were in student-affiliated papers of Harvard University, of Harvard alumni, I believe. But this is from the Harvard Gazette. It's a warning on homeschooling. It's a full-length interview. We'll talk about it today, but everybody should check it out for themselves. I've said before that they should have saved the characters and deleted NING and just called it for what it is. It's a war on homeschooling. And with us today, we have Patrick Wolf, again, a PhD holder from Harvard University. And just so the listeners know, Patrick was my dissertation chair at the University of Arkansas, where he's currently a distinguished professor in the Department of Education Reform over there. So it looks like we have a good amount of people because everybody wants to hear Patrick Wolf demolish the arguments of Elizabeth Bartholet like he did in Education Next. But without further ado, Matthew Nielsen, can you get us started with a more formal introduction?
Yeah, sounds good. So I'm Matthew Nielsen. I'm the board chair at the Educational Freedom Institute, joined as always by Corey DeAngelis, the executive director at EFI. He's also the director of school choice at the Reason Foundation and an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute. Our special guest today is Dr. Patrick Wolf. He is professor and 21st century chair in school choice at University of Arkansas. He's the author of dozens of studies and other publications on school choice. So thank you, Dr. Wolf, for coming to chat with us.
Happy to be here, Matthew and Corey. I wanted this slot because it was originally advertised as the Chris Stewart spot, so I figure I'd have a much bigger audience if they were expecting Chris.
We had a lot of fun with Chris. What was that? Just Friday. Probably one of the most engaging conversations we had yet until today, obviously, because Patrick Wolf, joining us. But we were talking about the Ravitchian movement, kind of like the whole school choice movement and where it's come from and where the arguments have gone, and talked a little bit about Diane Ravitch's latest book as well and the arguments that she puts forth in there. But Patrick Wolf, I know that you're familiar with those, but yeah, let's get into this demolition job that you provided in response to the original article by Elizabeth Bartholet, or not particularly by Elizabeth Bartholet herself, but that was in Harvard Magazine by Aaron O'Donnell that highlighted the work of Elizabeth Bartholet. So what's your main take on that risks of homeschooling article?
Yeah, so there are a lot of people, including you, Corey, who put out some great pieces criticizing that Harvard Magazine article. So what I did is I did a deeper dive into the law review article, the 60-page law review article that was the subject of the Harvard story, and just to see, hey, is there compelling evidence in this published law review article in support of the claims, the very strong claims that she was making in that Harvard Magazine story, which I got a copy of it because I'm an alum of Harvard University, and that was sent out to their entire alum mailing list. In fact, I got 2 copies because my wife is an alum as well. so it was really quite shocking how many inconsistencies, factual errors, unsubstantiated claims, just hysterical, not historical, but hysterical statements were in that law review article. So Matthew Lee and Angela Watson and I really kind of focused. I mean, we just had to set out the wreckage and say, you know, what are the most important flaws, because we don't have enough time to catalog all of them. And we put together, you know, our strongest, you know, critique, the most significant flaws in this Education Next post that we put out about 10 days ago. So
to walk us through, like, from your perspective, Pat, what is the biggest, like, what's just the central argument that, or if there is one, maybe there are more than one?
Sure. I mean, the central argument she's making, and of course, we always try to be fair to the arguments and the evidence of people we disagree with. That's a core civic virtue and a central point of being a scholar. And her argument is that it's very important that young adults be able to choose their own vision of the good life. That's part of liberal, the liberal kind of vision for people choosing their own distinctive sort of vision of the good life. She feels that, or she argues that, children who are homeschooled are severely inhibited from choosing their own view of the good life because they are sheltered and indoctrinated by their parents. But she really goes beyond that and says they also are regularly abused by their parents. That many homeschool families specifically homeschool their children because they want to abuse them outside of the purview of public school officials. So it's a very strong claim that she's making. And you know, what really surprised us is the absence of evidence to support. I mean, usually the stronger the claim you make, the more evidence you need to bring to support it. But it's, you know, she mainly relies on the story, the sad story of a single young person who was homeschooled and was abused, and that she hangs most of her argument on that one outlier case.
I mean, it's almost, it seems ridiculous to me that, I mean, if you take that same logic, you could apply it to the government school system, right? You can apply it to any system of any sort, right? You can just say, I found this one kid who was bullied and who committed suicide, therefore we should ban all government schooling altogether, or even just all schooling altogether, because we can find that, you know, evidence in any sector. Pat, what is your take on the evidence that she does provide, or does she not? You know, you talk about how she usually doesn't provide evidence, but what about when she does, you know, provide evidence or try to contend with the evidence? What is your main takeaway there?
You know, when she does, if you follow the footnotes, you know, most of the citations are in the footnotes. She mischaracterizes I mean, first of all, she doesn't rely on many empirical studies. There probably are 60 to 70 empirical studies of homeschooling in the United States in the entire literature. Brian Ray has reviewed it, and there have been a couple of meta-analyses of it as well. So, you know, there are studies out there. Obviously, you can't randomly assign children to homeschooling. You know, they're homeschooled by their parents because their parents really care about their education and are motivated to customize it to fit their needs, which is one of the flaws in her argument is that she claims that most families who homeschool don't care about their child's education, which is a ridiculous statement, because if parents don't care about their child's education, then of course the path of least resistance is letting someone else teach them. So if you're gonna go to the time and effort to teach your child, you can be accused of a lot of things, but it's ridiculous to suggest you don't care about your child's education. And actually, she criticizes some of the homeschooling research by saying, by making the opposite argument. And this is part of a pattern you see in her law review article, is she contradicts herself at different points. So she argues homeschoolers don't care about their child's education, but the research showing that that outcomes for homeschooled kids are much better than for similar kids in public schools has to be discounted because homeschool families care so much more about their child's education. So she wants to have
Which one is it?
Yeah. And similarly, she argues that we don't know how many students are being homeschooled, that there's so little oversight of it. We don't know what the denominator is, but she makes almost 100 claims throughout the law review article that most, or a majority of homeschoolers are like this, are scary in this particular way.
But she doesn't use any statistics to back that up.
She doesn't use statistics. And then when you look at the footnotes, like, for example, she cites the National Center for Education Statistics study, which is limited, but it's one of the best descriptive studies we have out there on homeschooling. And it concludes that 16% of homeschool families say they homeschool for religious reasons. But she argues throughout the article that a majority of them,
or up to 90%.
Yeah, up to 90%. So somehow 16% grows to up to 90%, are doing it for religious indoctrination purposes. So it was really shocking what a thin reed the tiny bit of evidence was that she was using to make these hysterical and sweeping accusations about the motivations and the actions of homeschooling parents.
And what's also interesting on that is she questions the motivations of the researchers too, of Brian Ray, which I think is unfounded. And, she doesn't really attack the methods of those studies all that much. As you said, the studies aren't perfect. We don't randomly assign kids to homeschool or not. But the best evidence we have from Brian Ray and others, like you said, tons of studies that he didn't even author, find positive effects. The majority of the studies find positive, at least relationships of homeschooling and on academic and social outcomes. But what she does is she doesn't use any citation, statistics at all to back up her claims, or what's interesting is she'll attack Brian Ray's research, but then she'll cite, researchers like Barbara Knox, who were, under investigation herself for, reportedly, nudging colleagues or peer pressuring colleagues to find abuse when abuse wasn't actually even happening. So, why doesn't she apply that same logic to her own researchers? I think it's because she's trying to uplift any negative effects of homeschooling and try to downplay every single positive study there is. And that study that she pointed to by Barbara Knox, the researchers themselves even said that this is a hand-picked sample of extreme cases, and then she uses those and generalizes to the whole population.
And it was something like 24 kids, wasn't it?
28, yeah.
28 kids.
Yeah. A 24 student sample of convenience. So, right. The two studies she relies on the most is that one, heartrending, biography of a child who was abused at home, and this 24 student sample of convenience. So that's basically the bulk of her empirical evidence are those two very limited studies. There's a saying in law that extreme cases make bad law. And her article really does play up this one extreme case of abuse in a homeschool family. And we don't know if the homeschooling caused the abuse. We just know that the child was abused and the child was homeschooled. And in fact, in her biography, she even mentions that she enjoyed many parts of the homeschooling. So she even she doesn't argue that it was the homeschooling that was the source of abuse. But Professor Bartholet wants this extraordinarily extensive regime of government oversight, government regulations of all homeschoolers because this one poor young lady was abused at home. And then, of course, as you mentioned, Corey, you took my course on research design and evaluation, and boy, I mean, that other study, the Knox study, checks all the boxes for a weak empirical study. A lack of random assignment, unrepresentative sample of convenience, low N. I mean, really.
Well,
it's amazing it got published. It's so weak.
Well, it is super weak, but I mean, to the credit of the researchers themselves, they put at the very end, like, this is a super limited sample of convenience. They say those things, and they say you shouldn't use this to extrapolate. You shouldn't run statistical tests on these numbers. But that didn't stop Bartlett from using it to say in her 80-page Arizona Law Review article and another article in the Boston Globe that came out just last month, where she made the claim that there's evidence that abuse rates are higher in the home than they are in schools. So she used that to extrapolate to the population and generalize and say that there's evidence that abuse happens more often in homes than in schools, which you can't say that from that study.
No, you can't. And I mean, there just isn't good research on that. We know, sadly, it happens in both places. And child abuse is a terrible thing. It's a horrible thing. I in no way seek to downplay or poo-poo child abuse. It's a horrific thing. It happens in the home. It happens in public schools, sadly. And the Choice Media has compiled a very long list of all the known cases, publicly reported cases of child abuse in public schools. And in many of those cases, the context includes a lot of information about how long the abuse went on, even when public school officials knew about it. And Professor Bartlett makes a big deal about how homeschooling is a greater risk of child abuse because public school officials are mandatory reporters if they witness abuse. But just because they're required to do it doesn't mean they actually follow through. And in many really tragic cases, school officials have looked the other way and missed obvious cases of abuse that have continued for long periods of time in the public school system. Again, I don't want to knock public school teachers. The overwhelming majority of them care about kids and protect children. The overwhelming majority of homeschooling parents protect kids, care about their children. The children are their children. They are strongly vested in their health and well-being. The cases of abuse in both homeschool environments and in public schools are exceptions. They're sad ones, and we just don't know. No one can honestly claim to know whether they happen more frequently in one schooling setting as opposed to the other.
Yeah, and I think the main difference here, though, is that although you're pointing out that some abuse happens in schools as well, you're not taking the next step and to say that this always happens in schools and that we should take a next step and to have some type of ban on schools themselves. You're saying this happens, but parents tend to be in the best position to make this decision, to homeschool their kid or to send them to one school over another. That's not, you're not making like these sweeping statements that have been made. Similar statements have been made by Elizabeth Bartlett. So I think it's totally fair to say, that abuse does happen sometimes in schools, but you're not. That's all you're pretty much saying. That's totally fair. And Chris Stewart just commented. I know Matthew, you pulled it up a second ago, but this report was super old. I don't know if you're familiar with it, Pat, but 2004, it's the latest report on the subject. The U.S. Department of Education estimated that 1 in 10 kids in government schools will be the victim of sexual abuse or sexual educator misconduct by the employees in the system themselves by the time they graduate from high school. So again, this may not be a causal study either, but we do have some evidence of this happening, in the system. It's not that, it's not that the system is perfect, whereas homeschooling, is like some horrible place where, is the only place where abuse ever happens. So,
Yeah, and what you get in the Bartholet argument is really the Bartholet article is lack of any serious consideration of the counterfactual. I mean, compared to Nirvana, I mean, compared to Utopia, homeschooling sometimes falls short in these ways, and therefore it should be presumptively banned. Well, let's not compare it to Utopia, because guess what? Utopia isn't what we get if we don't homeschool. We get an institutional school, a private school, public charter school, a traditional public school. That's the counterfactual. That's the alternative for these kids. What's true in those venues compared to homeschooling? That's the best we can do. And when we consider the counterfactual, like for example, in her claim that many or most or a majority of homeschoolers, which, as you've pointed out, Corey, she loves that word, many. She loves it.
She used many or some 210 times. You said most or whatever, 100 other times. But yeah, many or some 210 times.
So if that's true, in the case of, she claims many or most, homeschool families are doing it to religiously indoctrinate their children and give them just a one-sided perspective on many life issues. When we transfer that to the public school sector, oftentimes we see cases, and I can't say if it's a majority of the time, but we often see cases where parents and students complain about only getting a one-sided view of key policy issues. We know there's been a strong movement to ban controversial books from public schools, including To Kill a Mockingbird. Public school systems are banning To Kill a Mockingbird. Most homeschool families I'm familiar with, and I have to admit, truth in advertising, in the interest of full disclosure, my wife and I homeschooled one of our sons for most of his academic career. And we met a lot of homeschooling families, and they are tremendously diverse. It was frustrating to see all the stereotyping that was in the Bartholet article about up to 90% of them are religious fundamentalists who are trying to indoctrinate their children. That's clearly not true. And there have been solid descriptive studies showing what the families, why they're homeschooling, what their political orientations are. They're all the way across the map ideologically. You have everything from crunchy granola back to the earth, liberals to conservative Christian, more right-wing folks, and everything in the middle. And when we started homeschooling in Montgomery County, Maryland, when I taught at Georgetown University, we quickly learned that Montgomery County, Maryland had the highest rate of homeschooling of any county in the country. And we're like, wow, that's really interesting. And we thought about it a bit, and it's, why do so many families in Montgomery County, Maryland homeschool their children? Because they can. Montgomery County, Maryland also has the highest proportion of adults with advanced degrees. So they have many families where, because at least one of the adults has an advanced degree, they bring in enough of an income that the other parent can customize and deliver the education of the child in the home. Or sometimes it's the other way around, that the parent with the advanced degree is the educator. In our case, my wife has master's degrees in education and English literature. So she was eminently qualified to homeschool our son, and we met all these amazing families. The adult who was homeschooling was a professional artist, so she taught art to the homeschool children in our cooperative. And that's another really misleading element of the picture that Bartholet paints, is that homeschooling is isolating of children. And Corey, you pointed that out with that graphic they had at the Harvard Magazine thing. They showed this poor homeschooled child behind bars, locked into their home, while the public school kids run around and play freely, which of course is the exact reverse of how homeschooling usually works relative to public schooling. Is we were outside doing stuff with Alex and with other children and families constantly throughout the day. We spent very little time learning actually inside our home. Basically, the world was our classroom, and Alex interacted with a ton of other kids on a regular basis through his homeschooling experience. And my sense is that certainly isn't exceptional. That's very common among homeschool families. Is that idea of using the home as your comfortable base, and then expanding well beyond it, and making the world your classroom.
Yeah, Pat, you pointed out that you got two of the hard copies of the Harvard Magazine article. And what's interesting, I don't know if you noticed, but they misspelled arithmetic.
I know. I was going to tell you, bring up the first version, Corey.
So here's the first version. Well, I'm not going to go and find that. It'll take too long, but I'll show everybody the revised version. They have 4 books. They're trying to take a swipe at homeschoolers with the Bible, of course, because, anti-conservative, anti-religious fear-mongering had to be incorporated. But they also included a book, Arithmetic. And originally, it was misspelled arithmetic with an A-T-I-C at the end. So Pat's version will have that since he got the print version. They didn't fix it in time for the print version that had already gone out, but online they switched it to arithmetic. And what's funny is people were arguing, trying to back them up by saying, well, maybe they did this on purpose because they're trying to say that homeschoolers can't spell, or they're trying to say that home. But if they would have kept it that way, they could have always made that argument. But they switched it and essentially admits that, oops, it was a mistake. And so it's completely a huge cell phone where, they're trying to attack the educations of homeschoolers, but at the same time, they misspelled, arithmetic in their own graphic. Pat, you point out that, they incorrectly, say that 90% of the homeschoolers are Christians, that they attacked, Christians in that image. In the latest Harvard article in the Gazette, they, again, she takes swipes at conservative Christians with this fear mongering. As you say, the percentage is actually a lot lower than that. But even if it was 90%, it shouldn't really be any of her business, right? Like it, if it were to be the case that 90% of homeschoolers were Christians, even though it's not, why would that, be a legitimate reason to have a presumptive ban on the practice? What do you think, Pat?
Well, I think it goes back to her central desire that young people be free to choose alternative visions of the good life. Now, we might think if that's really what she seeks, then she should probably support the idea of children being exposed to biblical views of the world, and the Quran and the Torah and various fundamental religious texts that many people believe hold important truths and guides to living. But of course, in public schools in the United States, they can't instruct students based on those. There's a whole set of views of the good life that are denied the educational experience of students in the public schools. So it's a tough argument for her to make that the homeschool experience is more isolating and more indoctrinating than the public school experience, because the public school experience by law and regulation can't include the many religiously inspired views of life, visions of a good life that are out there. So I think that's a problem. That's a problem for her. And the bottom line is, hey, parents have significant influence over their children for 18 years. Until they reach the age of majority. So only for a very small, the typical lifespan now is over 70 years. People are expected to live over 70 years. So for less than a quarter of that time, about a quarter of that time, parents have a significant amount of influence. And then children have become adults and have their own rights and are freely able to choose the good life. I think Bartholet's concern is that they will be so favorably disposed towards the view of the good life that their parents shared with them in this happy homeschooling environment that they won't be tempted to switch to a more secular view of the good life that Bartholet appears to promote. I mean, I don't know. I can't see inside her heart and soul. Mm-hmm. I know throughout her article, she talks about knowing the motivations and intentions of other people. I don't claim to have that metaphysical power. But
you don't need to either.
No, I don't.
I don't rely on that.
I just know what people say and do. I'm a social scientist. I just know what they say and do. I don't know what they feel and what their motives and their conscience is. But basically, what we see is parents have this short window of opportunity to shape the values and behaviors of their children, and then their children are cast free. They're like birds to leave the nest and live their own life, and they can rely upon that foundation that parents have helped them build, and then they can change it and adapt it to suit their own preferences and their own vision. So, I mean, I think this idea, I think Bartholet doesn't give young adults enough credit for their own agency and their own ability, to choose a set of values and behaviors that isn't exactly the same as their parents. And I know, I mean, all of us who have adult children know, I mean, we love them to death. We did our best in shaping their values, and they're different than we are. I mean, I don't know of a single young adult who's a cookie cutter image of their parents and shares all of their values, because they are free individuals and they have their own free will and their own agency. And homeschooling and other values-rich educational environments, whether you find that in private schools and public charter schools or in traditional public schools, if they're a value-rich environment, then it's going to give the young adult a solid grounding and also the motivation for them to seek out, their own path and their own way.
So we should at least note, and we won't impute motives here or even dig too much into what actual expertise is, but we should at least note what it is that Elizabeth Bartholet does at Harvard and what her expertise is at least listed as, right? So I haven't found anywhere on Harvard's website, on her faculty page, where it lists anything about homeschool or education. And that doesn't surprise me necessarily, because she's gotten so much wrong, right? in that respect. So that's not surprising to me. But what does get listed here as her areas of interest are child welfare, civil rights and civil liberties, children and the law. And really, this is where the majority of her publications seem to be, at least, are in adoption and foster care. And so, that her child advocacy program, I think, is the name of the program that she runs at Harvard. But that's the homeschool piece is new. Somehow that came out of left field for her to be focusing on that, because her historical focus seems to be on adoption and foster care and things like that. So again, I don't know her personally. I don't know her well. All I can see is what has been published. And it seems to be that the majority of what's out there is really focused on those things. And so for her to be commenting as an authority figure on homeschool and homeschooling outcomes and on the conditions within families where homeschooling is taking place seems out of place. I don't know how that came to be.
It seems like it was a timing thing, and I think the timing was terrible. Rick Hess made this point in his op-ed about it. Is suddenly every parent of a K-12 student in the country is home educating that child. Now, it's not exactly the same as homeschooling, but they are guiding, directing, and participating in the home education of their child by order of the state to protect the safety of the child. And so then Bartholet's article comes out saying homeschooling is dangerous to children. So first of all, it throws panic into every parent.
Oh no, what do we do?
Oh no, this is horrible for our children. And the other thing is, of course, when you think about what homeschooling is, and it is parents being actively and deeply involved in the education of their child, well, there's tons of social science research on what a good thing that is. That the more involved parents are in their child's education, the better the outcomes are for that child. In a way, that's the silver lining of COVID-19. Is it really pushed every family, every parent to at least temporarily be more active in their child's education. And sure, it takes work, and sure, there are frustrations with it. But I've certainly heard a lot of chatter on Twitter saying, this is nice. This is nice. We're doing some neat things together educationally. It's interesting and valuable for me as a parent to be more deeply involved in my child's education. And that could be the story that came out of the Harvard magazine, but no, instead it's that homeschooling is very risky and dangerous. Most parents don't want to do it, aren't interested in their child's education. Most parents are not qualified in significantly being involved in their child's education, and most parents who want to homeschool are abusive. I mean, that was the message that they put out, when we are all homeschoolers now. I mean, it was ridiculous.
Yeah.
And I mean, you know what, Pat? They before this most recent article came out, they could have said something like, they could have hinged on the argument that, well, we already planned this. Her Arizona Law Review article was already written a long time ago. We had this Harvard Magazine article written months ago. We just, we weren't thinking when it came out in the May-June issue. But I mean, that conference was planned a long time ago, and look, we canceled it because of COVID-19. But then they did this most recent interview with her, and I know you've seen it already in the Harvard Gazette, where she essentially triples down on her original attack on homeschooling, and she doesn't back off one bit. And I would argue that this particular interview that happened, pretty recently, it just came out a couple of days ago. I think this one is even further out there than her, the magazine piece or the Arizona Law Review article. Do you have any particular thoughts on this most recent piece?
Well, a couple of thoughts. One is, I just don't understand what Harvard's trying to do. Because, the Harvard Magazine is the communication device for alums of Harvard, many of whom have homeschooled their children or are homeschoolers themselves. And the Harvard Gazette is the official, the official's spokesperson vehicle for Harvard University. So it is the publicity vehicle for the university. And so they are deliberately trying to send a message that homeschooling is dangerous and homeschoolers are bad. Now, they also enroll a lot of homeschoolers because, as you alluded to earlier, Corey, homeschoolers regularly win the Scripps National Spelling Bee contest. They regularly score perfect scores on the SAT. Supposedly they're isolated and their parents can't teach them, but amazingly, they just dominate in all of these academic contests. And so Harvard enrolls a substantial number of homeschooled students, and the Harvard Gazette has even published stories about how wonderful the homeschoolers of Harvard are and how easy they acclimate to intellectual and social life at Harvard University. We're not hearing any of that now. We're just hearing Harvard sending this big bat signal, homeschooling bad, homeschooling dangerous, homeschoolers bad. And I just don't understand what they're trying to accomplish, because they are at risk of alienating a pretty sizable number of their students, alums, and parents of students.
So Patrick, you do a lot of research in, private school choice. We just had a publication accepted finding, the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program reduced crime and paternity suits. Well, I don't want to switch to there yet, but I wanted to get your thoughts on in Elizabeth Bartholet's 80-page Arizona Law Review article. She uses about a page or a page and a half to talk about private school reform. I don't know. Do you want to talk about, maybe some of the thoughts she lays out here? She pretty much, goes on to say that, private schools have some of the same problems as homeschoolers. A lot of them are religious. And, what I thought was most interesting, and I want to get your take on this sentence, is that she says it would be deeply unfair to allow those who can afford private schools to isolate their children from public values, whatever those are, in private schools reflecting the parents' values, while denying this possibility to those unable to afford such schools. I don't want you to assign motives, because I know you don't like to do that, but what do you think she means by this statement in particular?
She's expressing a concern. And it's a concern that seems to is assumed to have a basis in reality and in empirical reality, but it really doesn't. And the assumption is that if government is controlling and directing a child's education, then the child is going to have stronger public and civic values than if a private sector organization or their own parents are directing their education. And there's actually a pretty extensive empirical literature on this. You know this, Corey. You've contributed to it, and many other scholars have. Dave Campbell, Richard Nemi. I mean, the famous. The eminent James Coleman, one of the most famous education researchers ever, really started the research on school type and civic outcomes. And when you consolidate all the information, there are just a few tiny findings, 3 findings out of almost 100 of government controlled public schooling producing better public values than privately controlled schooling. Instead, you see a majority of the studies, and here we can say a majority, right? Because we have a complete count. We know the population. A majority of the findings are that schools of choice, private schools, public charter schools, and even homeschooling produces students with stronger civic values, stronger tolerance, more active citizenship involvement in politics, more active involvement in their community. So basically, government control and direction of education is in many cases justified by the need to have citizens who are tolerant, politically informed, politically active, and involved in their communities. Well, it turns out that when schools of choice do that job for the government, the outcomes are better. The civic outcomes are better for kids, particularly in political tolerance. And that's a real problem for Bartholet, because her argument is that you have to have public involvement of public officials, you have to have government control, or children will be intolerant.
Mhm.
But the evidence completely undermines that claim. I'm going to tell you a quick story from when I was at Georgetown University. So, Georgetown University is a Catholic Jesuit university. The year I started there in 1998, they had just renovated their largest classroom building. That classroom building, since it was built, had crucifixes in each classroom. It's Catholic university. It's just a reminder of the Catholic identity and religious identity of the university. So some members of the faculty and some students protested that the crucifixes should not be returned to the classrooms, because that was intolerant and that was intolerant of non-Catholics who were attending Georgetown University. And it looked like that argument was going to win until the leaders of the Jewish student group and Muslim student group at Georgetown University came out in favor of the crucifixes being returned to the classroom. Now, that surprised a lot of secularists, at Georgetown, because they're like, wait a second, you should oppose Catholicism and as intolerant towards you. And they said, no, we are people of faith. We have a deep commitment to our own faith. It's not Catholicism, it's a different faith. But we are very respectful of other people who have a deep commitment of faith. And we seek to live with them, to learn with them, and to understand their faith tradition as we live out our own. And so we know this is a Catholic university. We want to be reminded of its sincere religious identity. We want those crucifixes in the classroom. So that won the day. That argument won the day. And I think it underscores this idea, this fallacy, that if a person has strong religious beliefs, they are necessarily intolerant. That's not necessarily the case at all. There are intolerant people who are deeply religious, and there are intolerant people who are thoroughly secular. Religion does not drive people to intolerance. It's really a choice that individuals from different traditions and backgrounds and value systems make themselves.
Well, and what's interesting is that in the same essay or interview, Elizabeth Bartholet, argues that homeschoolers are going to be intolerant, but at the same time, she expresses anti-conservative, anti-Christian intolerance.
Right.
But at least she doesn't say so explicitly, but it seems like she, at least appeals to a lot of anti-Christian, conservative, sentiments. In her arguments. And then for listeners, really quickly, though, Patrick talked about the review of the evidence finding that school choice leads to better civic outcomes. It's actually a chapter in this book, School Choice, Separating Fact from Fiction. Patrick Wolf is the editor of the volume, and that's chapter 4, Do Self-Interested Schooling Selections Improve Society? I authored that one. It's the evidence on that is tends to be positive.
Well, and there's a great review in there of the literature review by Brian Ray that goes over a lot of what we're talking about here. In fact, I can't remember if that lit review actually has it or not. You'll know this, Pat, but it talks about tolerance. I want to say that he did cover that in that one, didn't he?
Yeah, he did. There are only a couple of studies. One of them is authored by Albert Cheng, who is my colleague at the University of Arkansas Department of Education Reform. He studied. What he did was he surveyed students who were at a Christian university. And so they all had chosen this Christian university to attend, but they came from different backgrounds. So they had the Christian value system of that university in common, but they had different schooling backgrounds. And he found that the ones who were homeschooled, which is supposedly the most isolating and intolerant form of schooling a child can have, the ones who were homeschooled actually had higher levels of political tolerance than the ones who were schooled in other type of schooling arrangements. Albert found, and so it's an interesting study. Mm-hmm. And what you see in Albert's study and in Brian Ray's review, I mean, Brian is very clear about the limitations, the research limitations of all these studies. You know, the problem of self-selection, the problem of these parents being so devoted to their child's education that they are going to take it upon themselves, you know, to educate them at home. So he acknowledges all that, and he says, you know, but this is what we know. What we know is that the outcomes are better, and we can't say for sure that it's better because of homeschooling per se, or because of the commitment of parents. But the Bartholet argument is that parents aren't committed. Homeschooling parents aren't committed, that they are dangerous, and they are likely to abuse their children. And there's just no evidence that happens, you know, in any kind of a systematic way and in any rate that's greater than other forms of schooling.
So Patrick, something really jumped out at me from the Harvard Gazette interview just a couple of days ago. And I want to read some of that to you related to abuse. And I want to get your thoughts on, you know, either what you think she's saying or, you know, just your reaction. But in the interview, she says something along the lines of, there's no requirement that homeschool children ever see any mandated reporters of abuse. Effectively, here's the important part. She says there's a right to abuse your child and to not educate your child just so long as you're homeschooling them. What do you think about that line of reasoning?
Yeah, I mean, there are so many things wrong with that statement. I mean, first of all, this is another inconsistency in her article. She claims at several places homeschooling is unregulated in the United States, entirely unregulated in the United States. And then in another section where she wants to argue that the strict government restrictions and oversight of homeschooling that she recommends as policy, that it's actually legal. We know it's legal because it's being done and it's been judged legal in a number of U.S. states. Well, wait a minute. If homeschooling is entirely unregulated, how can we know if regulations are legal? You claim we know they're legal because they've been implemented successfully throughout the United States. So you know, it's this idea, you know, this same idea, of an inconsistency. But in that particular statement, she is equating sort of the opportunity for, because there's a chance someone could. She's equating that is the behavior that will take place. So because there isn't a government official standing inside their home, you know, overseeing the instruction and following them all around the world where homeschoolers go in their homeschooling experience, you know, because there isn't sort of a big brother watching all the time, that you know, an opportunity for abuse becomes a expectation of abuse, and that's ridiculous. It's an uncharitable and legally questionable position of you are guilty until proven innocent. And that's really what she's suggesting. She says there should be a presumptive ban on homeschooling. We should presume parents who want to homeschool are incompetent and want to do it for indoctrination and abuse purposes. And so they should have to prove, essentially in a court of law, that they can be involved in their child's education.
Well, just imagine if you applied that to any other area of life. I mean, you could essentially take away tons of liberties by that line of reasoning, right? I mean, it flips our legal system on its head for starters, that it would essentially have us all guilty until proven innocent. But, you know, if that's such a good idea between the ages of 5 and 18, why not start at age 0 and hand our kids to the government between the ages of 0 and 5? Because look, if you have nothing to hide, well, you should be more than happy to surrender your kids to the government. Same thing with food, right? We want kids to eat healthy food. We should have to pay a government, employee to come eat dinner with us every night so that he could check or make sure our dinners are okay, right?
Eat your veggies, Corey.
We have
Right.
broccoli. Oh, you don't have broccoli. Oh, so but if you're feeding them broccoli already, you shouldn't have any problem with that, I think, is her line of reasoning.
Right. And the other clear problem, I mean, there are like 6 or 7 problems with that statement. But the other really important one is it's not true that there's no monitoring or oversight of the products of a child's home education. The children, the overwhelming majority of children, I mean, we don't have exact numbers on it. But the families I see or hear of homeschooling, they take their children to the doctor. The doctors see them on a regular basis. They take them. Yeah, they take them to community organizations where public officials who are mandatory reporters. I mean, if they saw clear signs of abuse, there are a number of officials that homeschool kids interact with on a regular basis who would be in a position to see that and report on it. And it's just it's an extreme caricature of homeschooling parents and homeschooling that it's isolationist, that they're imprisoned in homes, and that nobody sees them except their parents. It's an extreme caricature, and it's really an uncharitable sort of picture that's being painted of the adults who are committed enough to their children's education and are taking a strong enough role in it. They actually want to customize it for their child's needs through homeschooling.
When she says that effectively abuse is legal because homeschool is legal, she's saying, I mean, it's just a very unserious comment. And because she's saying, because obviously child abuse is illegal, right? So we know that. So when it's a false equivalency, right? So I mean, she wasn't, I'm not going to say that she was saying like child abuse is legal, because
she did. She said that. Effectively, it's legal.
Effectively,
homeschool your kids.
Right. No person has the right to abuse another person. No adult has the right to abuse a child, whether they're their parents or not. That is no. It's an unserious statement. But I think it just stems from her personal view, her confidence in government officials and government institutions to prevent abuse and problems at an arm's length from a child and their family. And this really gets at the principle of subsidiarity, which is a really core principle of education and school choice. And the principle of subsidiarity is that the person who is closest to a danger or a problem, and who would bear the most consequences for a danger and a problem, should have the authority to take action to prevent it. And when it comes to a child who is neglected, abused, and has bad educational and social outcomes, who bears the most burden if that happens? Well, the parent does, right? Because then that child's going to be dependent on the parent well past, the age of 18. They'll be financially dependent on the parent, and such. So that's really placing, if you rely on parents to direct their child's education, either through homeschooling or through active involvement in a school choice for that child, then you are following the principle of subsidiarity. You're putting authority where it's going to be held most accountable, because the outcomes for a parent's child really reflect on that parent, and the parent suffers the consequences of it. Whereas in the public school system, with government accountability, hierarchical accountability, political accountability, that's what's called low leverage accountability, because it's distant from the child themselves. Yes, we hope that education officials in government-run public schools care about their students. We suspect many do. We hope that they do. But the bottom line is if a child isn't successful in their school, they don't carry as much of that personal burden as if your own child is not successful in terms of the burden a parent carries. So parents carry more of the burden. They should be given substantial authority, and far from assuming that they are uncaring and abusers. We should assume that they're going to want the best for their child, because they know their child better than anyone else, and it's on them if things don't work out.
Yeah, and if there's any evidence of wrongdoing, then the government should step in. And I think we all agree here. And I think, any reasonable homeschool advocate would agree with that statement as well.
Definitely.
That, no one should be able to abuse their children. We're just saying that if there is evidence of abuse, the government should then step in. It shouldn't be this other way around where it's all, everyone being guilty until proven innocent. But one more thing I want to point out. I know we're coming up to an hour, so Pat, just tell us whenever you got to jump off. But an update for the viewers from the most recent, Harvard Gazette piece. In her interview, she said something else that was kind of surprising to me, in that in all the other pieces, she has kind of backed off a little bit and said, this is just a presumptive ban. It's not, like an all-out ban. If you have nothing to worry about, then you should, the benevolent government officials and myself will approve of you and will allow you to educate your own children at home. So, there shouldn't be that much of a problem. It's not a real ban like they have in Germany. But what's interesting is later on in the conversation, even though she started out the interview saying something like that, she says in the same, paragraph, I would not ban all homeschooling. Just, I just want you to show that you're worthy. Maybe you have a super athlete, like Tim Tebow, he was homeschooled, maybe they're in horrible public schools. But what was interesting to me is that she said that even if we grant these parents permission to homeschool, I would still require that their kids participate in at least some school courses and extracurricular activities. So I don't know about you guys, but to me, that sounds like she's saying, I'm going to call this homeschooling, but I'm still going to go, require them to, participate in some government school or, maybe a private school option, or maybe they'll have to go play sports or something at the nearby public school.
Many of them do, and in fact, that was another sort of self-contradiction in her article. She says many, her favorite word, many homeschool kids are isolated in their homeschool experience. And then later on, she says many of them participate in extracurriculars, including sports. So it can't, or most. I think she said most in both cases. Most are isolated, and most participate in extracurriculars. So it's sure. I think it's a great thing that many homeschool kids also participate in organized sports, interact with kids who are going to their neighborhood public school, and sometimes take individual courses. I'm a big supporter of course choice, and I know that homeschool kids do that. There are even homeschooling models, hybrid homeschooling models that have emerged where the child is homeschooled for a few days a week and then is conventionally schooled in brick and mortar schools a few days a week. Also, usually homeschooling is a choice for a certain period of time for a child. And then when the parents learn of a brick and mortar school that they think is a good match for their child's needs at that point in their life, the child then moves to a brick and mortar school. So all of this regular contact, we do know, we can say factually that the majority of students who are homeschooled have some contact with a traditional public school. Either they enroll in one at some point in their career, or they participate in a course choice or a extracurricular. So if parents are motivated to isolate their children through homeschooling, why do they keep exposing? Why do most of them expose them to the public schools and public school officials when that is a good fit for their vision. So it just, you just can't get a straight story from the Bartholet article and the Bartholet argument. There's so many self-contradictions in it, and it adds up to her fears. And I'm not going to question the legitimacy of her fears. She is concerned about child abuse, and I am too. And we all are. It's a terrible thing. We all need to be concerned about it. But there's just no evidence that what she is attacking is the cause of child abuse. It's an alternative way to educate children that tends to produce very high levels of academic achievement and very high levels of tolerance and civic virtue in children. So why should we attack it? Why shouldn't we make it available in a very pluralistic sense as one option for families in preparing young people? Because it's an alternative that so far has demonstrated very positive results.
It seems to work really well. Yeah.
Well, Patrick, then, we'll have, conservative Christians educating their own children at home. We can't have that.
I mean, with the stereotyping in the article, it just seems like she doesn't like conservative Christians, and it's really sad to see, those expressions of intolerance on her part in that article. And we flagged a couple of them specifically in our essay just because they jumped out at us. I mean, she suggested that an adult who has a disability is incapable of homeschooling a child, which is ridiculous. To have that kind of a stereotypical view of people with disabilities is really disturbing to me, because I once worked as an advocate for people with disabilities. There are many people with disabilities who would be excellent home educators of their children. And just, stereotyping and writing off entire classes of people, conservative Christians, Christian fundamentalists, adults with disabilities, as having illegitimate reasons for homeschooling. So she wants to be able to judge the reasons people have for homeschooling, and then making these blanket judgments about the capability of different types of people to educate their children. It was really disturbing to me.
In that same part of the 80-page article, she also pointed out people's education levels. This many people had higher education degrees, as if you need that to teach someone, kindergarten level stuff. But that's another thing that I'm concerned about with the idea of a presumptive ban, because look, who's going to be able to make the decision of who is worthy? Are they going to say you have this disability, so you're obviously not worthy of educating your kids? I think that would be totally ridiculous, and I don't trust the government to make that decision. What if it's oh, you're a conservative Christian? I think that would be unconstitutional. Obviously, a presumptive ban would also be unconstitutional in my view. But what's to stop people from saying, well, you don't have a teaching certificate, so you can't be a homeschool parent, even if you have a PhD, or you don't have a PhD, so you can't be a homeschool parent. I think that's
right.
Also,
right. It's problematic. It's presumptive of people's intentions and motivations, and it's also presumptive of their abilities. And it shows her ignorance about what homeschooling is and how homeschooling operates, because as a homeschool parent, I mean, my wife and I we weren't providing the direct instruction for our son in all of his fields. We did it in the fields where we had graduate degrees and deep content knowledge. Other than that, we facilitated his access to educational experts through online means or through homeschooling networks, so that he was always being taught by an adult who had deep content knowledge in the discipline. But it wasn't always us, and it doesn't always have to be. I mean, that's the thing. It's a misunderstanding of what a homeschool parent has to be and do. A homeschool parent has to know their child. They have to care about their child's education, and they have to go to the effort of arranging an educational program for that child that is going to serve their needs. And that's going to be delivering some instruction themselves directly to the child, and oftentimes arranging for other educational experts and content experts to teach their child. And when done well, it's just a beautiful thing.
So Pat, again, I know we're going over, but I want to add in a little bit of historical context for this. In her 80-page article, she hinted what I thought would be a private school ban, because she said something along the lines of, it wouldn't be fair for rich people to isolate their kids in private schools where, lower income people, might not be able to have that ability. I would say that would be a legitimate argument for vouchers to allow low income people to do the same thing. But the other alternative is that she could be calling for a ban on private education altogether, not just homeschooling. In your class, I learned, some of the history about, a law in 1922 in Oregon. Could you, kind of go through that?
Yeah, so there was a lot. We have to remember that through most of its history, government-run public schools were religious schools. Through most of their history, they were Protestant religious schools. The King James Bible was required reading. There was clear and documented antipathy towards both Catholics and conservative Protestant denomination. So the idea was public schools will be mainline Protestant because mainline Protestants had the most political power at that point. And that's, government institutions reflect the political power of subgroups. And so the supposed so-called common school was mainline Protestant for most of its history up until the 1950s. But in the 1920s, then the Ku Klux Klan was quite concerned about the number of Catholic private schools that were allowed to operate in the country. And so the Ku Klux Klan organized a group of political leaders and a political coalition to ban private schooling in the state of Oregon. And they passed a law that outlawed private schooling. So parents could not send their children to a private school. And at that point, homeschooling was outlawed in Oregon and most other U.S. states. But let's go ahead.
What was the argument made by why would the KKK be behind this? I'm not saying none of us are saying that Bartholet is the same thing as the KKK, but I just want to understand,
yeah, we don't know what the KKK's motivation was, but we know that they were anti-Catholic, right? I mean, they were anti-African American, they were anti-Catholic, and they saw Catholic schools as a rival to the authority, the influence that they could have through the public school system. Because they were very politically powerful at that point in the 1920s. And so they passed this law. Oregon banned private schooling. The Little Sisters of the Poor, which was a group of nuns that ran Catholic schools in Oregon, sued, calling the law unconstitutional and an unconstitutional restriction on the free exercise of religion. Went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court issued a unanimous ruling that it was unconstitutional for Oregon to ban private schooling. And in that unanimous decision, they made the famous statement that the child is not the mere creature of the state, that children do not belong to the government. They belong first and foremost to their parents, but many parents believe that children belong to God ultimately, and that both parents and the state are custodians of children and have an obligation to protect them and to advance their well-being. And so in Pierce versus Society of Sisters, the Supreme Court was making a clear statement that yes, we have government-run public schools to educate children, but we must always permit various forms of private schooling if parents choose them, because it's not for the state to decide how a child should be brought up.
Absolutely. And I was looking into this, more, since this whole homeschooling thing popped up again. And there was another case a couple of years before Pierce, Meyer versus Nebraska, that kind of also gave, way to being essentially a constant, the courts were ruling in favor of homeschool families there as well, that parents essentially have the right to educate their children in the household. So, we have these two separate court cases that, to me, it looks like any type of presumptive ban, or especially an outright ban on homeschooling, would be unconstitutional in the United States.
Yep.
Yeah, it's evolved that way. I mean, we've gone from a situation where homeschooling was banned in every state in the country to a condition now where homeschooling is legal in every state in the country, to, we're evolving to a point where it would be defended as it's necessary that you allow it as an option for families, so that the families, the parents, again, can take advantage of this precious window of just a dozen or so years where they can shape the education of their child and the values that will be a part of that education. And then the child can go forth and make their own free and fair decisions based on their own lights.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
It makes total sense. Yeah, we could keep going for another couple hours, Pat, but we've taken more, time than we probably should have from you. So, thanks so much for being on. We got to have you on again. Just like Jay as well. We need to have both of you guys on. You guys have so much wealth of knowledge, so much things to talk about. It's always a pleasure to talk with you, Pat. Do you have any last words on, this kind of whole situation, or, anything that?
I just want to applaud you guys for this video podcast that you're doing. It's very interesting. The people you're bringing on are terrific. I've enjoyed learning from them and the engagement. And the bottom line, I think what's really important is let's reason together towards the truth on these things, and let's not take reckless shortcuts like questioning people's motives or exaggerating the facts or contradicting ourselves. Let's just be very careful and serious and scholarly in how we approach these things, and not stereotype people and be presumptive in our judgments. When you start with a statement, presumptive ban, I mean, right there, that just says, boy, you better have a lot behind this. And of course, as we pulled back the curtain, we saw there was nothing but factual errors and inconsistency behind that argument for a presumptive ban. Let's give our fellow human beings more credit than that.
All right. And with that, thank you so much again, Patrick Wolf, the distinguished professor at the University of Arkansas's Department of Education Reform. And as you can tell today, he is, a PhD holder out of Harvard University, and he totally destroyed the arguments by the Harvard law professor Elizabeth Bartholet. I'll link to his article in Education Next in the comments. Also, I'll link to his one of his recent books, School Choice: Separating Fact from Fiction, where there's tons of literature reviews on all of the different inconsistent and illogical arguments against choice. And on a related note, I'll also link to this forthcoming book, co-edited by myself and Neil McCluskey at the Cato Institute. Patrick Wolf actually has a really good chapter in this book. I think this is the most exciting chapters in the books, where he updates his literature review linking private school choice to civic outcomes such as tolerance, like we talked about earlier today. You can get this, pre-order it on Amazon for the low price of $24.95. Well worth $25 to be able to take away the school choice myths that are all too often discussed in the school choice debate.
You the hand model in that photo, in that cover photo?
No, I don't know who did that. It's definitely not me.
It was George Costanza.
Good to watch, right?
But yeah, so thanks so much, Pat, and thank you to all the listeners. Everybody. We've had a lot of comments and people very engaged with this discussion. So thank you so much. Until next time, what's Friday? We'll see you guys again at the Educational Freedom Institute podcast.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks.